Edward Hastings stood by the grand window of his study, overlooking the sprawling gardens of the Hastings estate. The soft hum of distant conversation from the drawing room carried through the crack under the heavy oak door. It was a sound he'd grown weary of, a chorus of shallow pleasantries and predictable platitudes from the same elite circles. His fingers drummed against the edge of the polished mahogany desk, his thoughts churning. "Do you ever wonder, Henry," he began, addressing his oldest and perhaps only confidant, "whether any of this matters?" Henry Whitmore, a lanky man with an ever-present smirk, leaned back in his chair and swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "This again?" he teased, but the sharpness of his tone betrayed genuine curiosity. The great Edward Hastings, heir to one of England's most esteemed families, questioning his gilded existence. Edward ignored the jab, turning fully to face him. "Every ball, every dinner, it's the same. People pretending to care about one another when all they want is an advantage, a connection, a match." Henry raised an eyebrow. "And you think you're above all that?" Edward paced the room. I wonder if it's possible for someone to succeed here purely on their character, without a title or fortune to back them. Could authenticity alone survive in these circles?" Henry's smirk deepened. "An interesting experiment. Do you have a volunteer in mind, or are you offering yourself as tribute?" Edward's lips quirked into a half-smile. "Not me. Someone better suited. Someone like—" He paused, his gaze drifting towards the corridor. A figure passed silently, a tray balanced deftly in her hands. "Eleanor?" Henry followed his friend's gaze. "The housekeeper? She's intelligent, resourceful, kind," Edward said, his voice quieter now. "But most importantly, she's unpolished, unpretentious. I wonder how she'd fare at one of these endless dinners." Henry straightened in his chair, the smirk giving way to genuine surprise. "You're serious?" Edward nodded. "Why not? It's a harmless dinner. If nothing else, it might prove that this society isn't as impenetrable as it seems." "And if it proves the opposite?" Henry asked. Edward hesitated. "Then perhaps it's a lesson we all need to learn." Eleanor Carter wiped her hands on her apron, her routine movements steady and practiced. The kitchen bustled with the rhythm of the household, the clang of pots, the hiss of boiling water, the occasional barked orders from Mrs. Howard, the cook. Eleanor, however, moved through it all with a calm that seemed almost unnatural. She was used to the rhythm of service, the unspoken hierarchy that kept the Hastings estate running smoothly. So when Edward Hastings approached her in the corridor that afternoon, she was caught entirely off guard. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone unusually formal. "Might I have a word?" Eleanor set down the tray she was carrying, her brow furrowing in cautious curiosity. "Of course, sir. I have a rather unconventional request," Edward said, shifting his weight. He was rarely at a loss for words, yet something about this moment made him unusually self-conscious. Eleanor tilted her head. "Go on. I'd like you to join us for dinner tomorrow evening," he said, watching her reaction carefully. For a moment, Eleanor thought she'd misheard. "Dinner, sir?" "Yes," Edward clarified. "As a guest, not a servant." The air between them seemed to still. Eleanor's mind raced. Was this some sort of test? A cruel joke? "I don't understand," she said carefully. Edward offered a small, disarming smile. "Consider it an experiment. I'd like to see how someone with your character and wit fares in a setting like this. No titles, no pretense. Just you." Eleanor hesitated. There was something genuine in his expression, but the absurdity of the request made her wary. "And Mrs. Howard? The other staff? They won't approve. They'll understand," Edward assured her. "I'll see to it." After a long pause, Eleanor nodded. "Very well, sir, if that's what you wish." That evening, as Edward and Henry sat in the drawing room, discussing the logistics of the plan, Henry couldn't resist another jab. "You realize you're playing with fire, don't you?" "Perhaps," Edward admitted. "But isn't it about time someone did?" "Just remember," Henry said, raising his glass in mock salute, "when the flames get too high, don't expect me to douse them." Edward smiled faintly but said nothing. His mind was already racing ahead, picturing the reactions of his peers. The tension in the room, and most importantly, Eleanor's quiet strength as she stepped into a world that had never been meant for her. Eleanor Carter stared at her reflection in the small mirror mounted on the wall of her modest quarters. The dim light of the single oil lamp cast soft shadows across her face, highlighting her furrowed brow. She still couldn't believe what had transpired that afternoon. Dinner, as a guest. The words echoed in her mind like the chime of a distant bell, both startling and surreal. Her first instinct had been to decline. Such an invitation felt like a breach of the invisible contract that governed the lives of the staff and the family they served. Yet there had been something in Edward Hastings' voice earnestness, perhaps even vulnerability, that had made her pause. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mary, one of the maids and her closest friend in the household. "I heard the most curious thing," Mary said, slipping inside and closing the door behind her. Her eyes sparkled with mischief. "Is it true? You're going to dine with the family?" Eleanor sighed. "It seems so," Mary gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Eleanor, do you realize what this means? That I'll likely make a fool of myself?" Eleanor replied dryly. Mary shook her head. "No, it means Amar. Hastings must see something extraordinary, and he wouldn't risk the scandal otherwise." Eleanor frowned. "Scandal, of course," Mary exclaimed. "Imagine what the guests will think when they see you sitting among them. They'll talk about it for weeks." The weight of Mary's words sank in, and Eleanor felt a flicker of doubt. Was Edward truly prepared for the backlash his decision might bring? Was she? The following morning, Edward sought out Eleanor in the conservatory, where she was tending to the plants. He approached with his usual confident stride, but faltered slightly as he saw her turn to face him, her expression unreadable. "Miss Carter," he began, "I wanted to ensure you feel comfortable with the arrangement." Eleanor set down her watering can and folded her hands neatly in front of her. "I'll admit, sir, I'm not entirely sure what to make of it." Edward nodded, as if expecting this. "I understand. It's unconventional, to say the least. But I hope you'll trust me when I say this isn't meant to embarrass you. Quite the opposite." "And what is it meant to do?" Eleanor asked, her tone steady but curious. Edward hesitated. How could he explain his desire to challenge the rigid social structures that defined their world without sounding naive or, worse, condescending? "I believe there's value in showing people that worth isn't tied to titles or wealth." "You embody that principle, Eleanor." Eleanor regarded him carefully. She had always respected Edward, not just for his fairness as an employer, but for the way he treated everyone with decency. Still, this felt like stepping into uncharted territory. "And if I fail?" "You won't," Edward said with quiet conviction. "I've seen how you carry yourself. You're more than capable." For a moment, they stood in silence. The morning sunlight filtering through the glass panes and illuminating the rows of greenery around them. "Very well," Eleanor said at last. "I'll do it." The hours leading up to the dinner were a blur of preparation. Eleanor enlisted Mary's help to borrow a suitable dress, a soft blue gown with delicate embroidery at the hem. It wasn't extravagant by aristocratic standards, but it was far removed from the plain uniforms Eleanor was accustomed to wearing. As Mary helped fasten the last button, she whispered, "You look like you belong in their world." Eleanor caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked poised and elegant, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was wearing a mask. "Let's hope they think the same," she murmured. The dining room was a masterpiece of opulence, with its crystal chandeliers, gleaming silverware, and a table set for 20. Eleanor entered with Edward at her side, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The murmur of conversation ceased as the assembled guests turned their attention to the unexpected pair. Lady Beatrice, Edward's formidable aunt, was the first to recover. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she addressed her nephew. "Edward, what is the meaning of this?" Edward's smile was calm but unwavering. "I've invited Miss Carter to join us this evening." "Miss Carter?" Lady Beatrice echoed, her tone laced with disbelief. "The housekeeper?" "Yes," Edward replied evenly. "I thought it would be an enlightening change." The room remained tense, the silence thick enough to cut with a knife. Eleanor felt every gaze on her, some curious, others incredulous. Summoning all her courage, she met their eyes and offered a polite nod. "How? Novel," another guest murmured, breaking the silence with an awkward laugh. Slowly, the conversations resumed, though Eleanor could sense the undercurrent of whispers and glances directed her way. Edward led her to a seat near the center of the table, a gesture that made it impossible for her presence to go unnoticed. As she sat, she caught his reassuring glance and gave a small, grateful smile. The first course was served, and the atmosphere gradually settled into a semblance of normalcy. Eleanor remained quiet, observing the interplay of personalities around her. She noted how Lady Beatrice dominated the conversation, steering it toward topics that excluded Eleanor by design. Yet when Edward turned to include her, asking for her thoughts on a recent novel, Eleanor's voice did not falter. "I've read it," she said. The author's insights into human nature are remarkably astute. The subtle ripple of surprise around the table was palpable. Lady Beatrice arched an eyebrow, but before she could comment, Lord Arthur Bellamy, a guest known for his sardonic wit, interjected. "A woman of letters, I see. How refreshing." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Knowledge is not reserved for the privileged, my lord." The remark, delivered with quiet confidence, earned a murmur of approval from some and a sharp glare from Lady Beatrice. Edward hid his amusement behind a sip of wine. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself growing more at ease. The initial tension had not entirely dissipated, but she sensed a shift subtle but undeniable. Her resolve strengthened with each passing moment. Whatever the outcome, she would not falter. The dining room, despite its grandeur, had begun to feel less oppressive by the time dessert was served. Eleanor had managed to navigate the evening with grace, deflecting pointed remarks and offering thoughtful contributions to the conversations Edward had carefully steered in her direction. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was under constant scrutiny. When the last plates were cleared, Lady Beatrice rose, signaling the transition to the drawing room for tea and, later, dancing in the adjoining ballroom. Eleanor braced herself. Surviving the dinner was one thing. Entering the social heart of the evening was another entirely. Edward lingered by her side as the guests filed out. His calm presence was a steadying force, though Eleanor noticed a faint tension in his jaw. He was aware of the risks he had taken and the scrutiny they both faced. "You've handled yourself admirably," he said quietly, "but the evening isn't over yet." "I hadn't forgotten," Eleanor replied, her tone light but her nerves evident. As they moved into the drawing room, Eleanor caught sight of Lady Beatrice conferring with a small group of guests. Her expression as sharp as her words were likely to be. Eleanor squared her shoulders. She wouldn't let whispers and glances intimidate her. The ballroom was a vision of elegance. Soft candlelight illuminated the room, reflecting off gilded mirrors and polished floors. A string quartet played in one corner, their music weaving through the air like a silken thread. Guests gathered along the edges of the room, their laughter and conversation blending with the melodies. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold. This was a world she had only observed from the sidelines, never one she had imagined stepping into. Edward offered her his arm, his smile warm and reassuring. "Shall we?" he asked. Eleanor took a breath and placed her hand on his arm. Together, they entered, their presence drawing immediate attention. Conversations faltered and heads turned. Edward, ever composed, guided Eleanor to a prominent spot near the center of the room, ensuring she would not be overlooked. "Quite the entrance," Henry Whitmore murmured as he joined them. He flashed Eleanor a charming smile. "You've become the most talked about person here, Miss Carter." "I suspect that wasn't my doing," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "Perhaps not," Henry conceded, "but you've certainly risen to the occasion. I dare say you've handled this evening better than most of us would have in your position." Eleanor offered a polite smile, though she couldn't help but wonder how sincere his words were. Was he genuinely impressed, or simply indulging in the novelty of the situation? As the music swelled, Edward turned to her. "Would you care to dance?" Eleanor hesitated. "I'm afraid I'm not well practiced." "Then we'll keep it simple," Edward assured her. He extended his hand, and after a brief moment, she accepted. They stepped onto the dance floor, joining the other couples moving gracefully to the music. Edward led with practiced ease, his movements fluid and confident. Eleanor focused on matching his steps, her initial awkwardness fading as she found the rhythm. The room around them seemed to blur, the curious stares and whispered remarks fading into the background. "You're doing wonderfully," Edward said, his voice low but encouraging. "That's kind of you to say," Eleanor replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Though I suspect not everyone here would agree." "Let them think what they will," Edward said firmly. "They'll see the truth soon enough." The dance ended, and the applause of the crowd pulled Eleanor back into the present. As they returned to the edge of the floor, she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Some guests seemed less guarded, their expressions softening with curiosity rather than judgment. Others, however, clung stubbornly to their disapproval. Lady Beatrice approached with the air of someone prepared for battle. Her sharp eyes flicked between Edward and Eleanor before settling on the latter. "Miss Carter," she began, her tone deceptively pleasant, "you've certainly made an impression this evening." "That was not my intention, Lady Beatrice," Eleanor replied evenly. "I only sought to enjoy the evening as any guest would." "Indeed," Lady Beatrice said, her smile tight. "Though I must admit, I find it fascinating that Edward chose to experiment in such a public manner." Edward stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Aunt Beatrice, Eleanor is here as my guest. She has conducted herself with dignity and grace, which is more than I can say for some." Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, another guest interjected. Lord Arthur Bellamy, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. "I must agree with Hastings," he said, his tone light but pointed. "Miss Carter has brought a breath of fresh air to what might otherwise have been another tiresome evening of predictable conversation." Lady Beatrice's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing further, retreating to a nearby group of like-minded guests. Eleanor allowed herself a quiet sigh of relief. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of music and conversation. While Eleanor couldn't entirely shake her unease, she found moments of genuine connection with a few guests, their curiosity gradually giving way to genuine interest. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the end of the festivities, Edward escorted Eleanor back to the drawing room, where the remaining guests were beginning to take their leave. "You've done it," Edward said as they stood near the doorway, watching the guests disperse. "You've proven them all wrong." "I'm not sure I've convinced everyone," Eleanor replied, "but perhaps I've shown that it's possible." "That's more than enough," Edward said with a smile. "You've exceeded every expectation, Eleanor. I hope you know that." Eleanor met his gaze, her earlier doubts softening. "Thank you, Edward, for everything." As the last of the guests departed, Eleanor felt a wave of exhaustion but also a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had stepped into a world that was not her own and held her ground. What lay ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time, she felt the faintest glimmer of possibility. The morning after the dinner, Eleanor woke to a pale winter light filtering through her small bedroom window. The events of the previous night lingered vividly in her mind. The tension, the whispers, and the unexpected moments of triumph. It had been a challenge unlike anything she had faced before, but she had survived. As she dressed and prepared for her usual tasks, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that things were different now. She wasn't sure if it was because of how she had conducted herself or the mere fact of her presence at the dinner. Either way, she knew the household and its inhabitants would never see her quite the same. Downstairs, the staff bustled with their morning routines, but a few cast curious glances her way. Mary approached her with a broad grin, clearly eager for details. So, Mary began, barely able to contain her excitement. "How was it?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to put her experience into words. It was, complicated. Complicated how? Mary pressed. Eleanor glanced around, ensuring they weren't overheard. It wasn't just a dinner. It felt like a test one. I wasn't entirely sure I was meant to pass. Mary frowned. Did Mr. Hastings seem upset? No, Eleanor admitted. If anything, he seemed pleased. But his aunt, Lady Beatrice, made it clear she didn't approve. Mary huffed. That woman would disapprove of a sunrise if it weren't arranged to her liking. Don't let her get to you. Eleanor smiled faintly, grateful for Mary's unwavering support. Still, she couldn't ignore the uncertainty lingering in her chest. The evening had left her feeling exposed, as though she had stepped into a role she wasn't quite sure she could play. Later that day, Eleanor found herself in the conservatory, tending to the plants as part of her usual routine. The quiet work was a welcome reprieve from the lingering questions and glances that had followed her all morning. It wasn't long before Edward appeared, his footsteps soft against the tiled floor. Eleanor straightened as he approached, unsure of what to expect. Miss Carter, Edward greeted her with a warm smile. I wanted to thank you again for last night. There's no need. Sir, Eleanor replied, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. I was only doing as you asked. You did far more than that, Edward said. You carried yourself with poise and dignity, even when faced with hostility. I couldn't have asked for more. Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, she said, it wasn't easy, but I appreciate your faith in me. Edward's expression softened. I realize I put you in a difficult position, and for that, I apologize. But I hope you understand why I did it. Eleanor nodded slowly. You wanted to challenge the way things are, to prove that someone like me could belong in your world. Exactly, Edward said, his voice firm. And you did. More than that, you shone. I hope you know that. Eleanor felt a flicker of warmth in his words, but also a pang of uncertainty. Do you think they saw it that way? Lady Beatrice certainly didn't. Lady Beatrice represents a dying way of thinking, Edward said. There were others who saw you for who you are. Lord Bellamy, for one. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. He seemed more interested in stirring the pot than in supporting me. Perhaps, Edward admitted, but even he couldn't deny your presence. That says something. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. If nothing else, it was an experience I won't soon forget. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as preparations began for the next gathering. More informal luncheon that promised a slightly less rigid social atmosphere. Despite this, Eleanor couldn't shake her apprehension. The dinner had been one thing. The luncheon would be another chance for her to face the scrutiny of Edward's peers. As the day of the luncheon approached, Edward sought her out again, this time in the library where she was dusting the shelves. I'd like you to join us for the luncheon, he said, his tone casual but resolute. Eleanor blinked, surprised. Another event, sir? Yes, Edward said. I believe it's important for you to be seen not just as a one-time novelty, but as someone who truly belongs. Eleanor hesitated. I'm not sure I agree. Last night was difficult. I'm not certain I'm ready to do it again so soon. Edward regarded her thoughtfully. I won't pressure you, Eleanor, but I believe in you. And I think, deep down, you believe in yourself too. His words lingered long after he left, leaving Eleanor to wrestle with her doubts. Could she truly face these people again? And if she did, what would it mean for her future? On the morning of the luncheon, Eleanor stood before her mirror once more, her nerves fraying as she adjusted the borrowed dress Mary had helped her prepare. This one was a soft green that brought out the warm tones of her complexion, simple but elegant. You look lovely, Mary said, fastening a delicate ribbon at the back. They won't know what hit them. Eleanor managed a weak smile. Let's hope that's a good thing. When she stepped into the drawing room where the guests had begun to gather, the familiar tension gripped her chest. Edward met her near the doorway, his expression calm and reassuring. Ready? He asked. As I'll ever be, Eleanor replied. Edward offered her his arm, and together they entered, their arrival drawing the attention of the assembled guests. Eleanor braced herself, determined to face whatever came next with the same resolve she had mustered at the dinner. The luncheon, like the dinner before it, would be a test, not just of Eleanor's ability to navigate this world, but of Edward's conviction that she belonged in it. The luncheon began with a deceptive ease. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the Hastings estate's drawing room bathed the gathering in a warm glow, and the hum of polite conversation filled the air. Eleanor, seated at the table alongside Edward, forced herself to focus on the beauty of the moment rather than the growing weight of the guests' glances. Unlike the formal dinner, the luncheon was a more relaxed affair, or so it was meant to be. Platters of food were served family-style, encouraging interaction and casual conversation. Yet, Eleanor couldn't help but notice the subtle undercurrents in the room. A sidelong glance here, a hushed whisper there. Her presence, once again, was the unspoken topic. Lady Beatrice, seated opposite Eleanor, wasted no time in asserting her authority. Her sharp features were softened only by the careful application of cosmetics, though no amount of powder could temper the sharpness of her tone. "Miss Carter," Lady Beatrice began, her voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of nearby guests. "I must admit, I find your presence here intriguing." Eleanor set her fork down carefully, meeting Lady Beatrice's gaze with an expression of calm curiosity. "I'm honored to hear that, Lady Beatrice." The older woman's lips curved into a thin smile. "Indeed, it's not often we are graced with the company of someone from, shall we say, a less traditional background." Edward, sensing the barb, leaned forward. "Aunt Beatrice, I believe tradition is most useful when it evolves to include the voices of those who have been unjustly excluded." The room grew quiet, the subtle tension sharpening into something more pronounced. Lady Beatrice arched an eyebrow. "Ah, the noble pursuit of inclusivity. How modern of you, Edward. But one must be cautious not to dilute the sanctity of certain spaces." Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady as she replied, "Sanctity, Lady Beatrice, is not diminished by diversity. If anything, it's enriched by it." A murmur rippled through the table, some guests nodding in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Lady Beatrice's smile tightened, and her eyes glinted with the promise of a sharper retort. But before she could speak, Lord Arthur Bellamy interjected. "Well said, Miss Carter," he drawled, raising his glass in mock salute. "It's rare to hear such wit paired with such poise. I find myself most entertained." His words, though framed as praise, carried a subtle edge. Eleanor turned to him, her gaze steady. "I'm pleased to have entertained you, Lord Bellamy, though I would hope you find the conversation more engaging than amusing." A low chuckle escaped him, and he inclined his head. "Touché, Miss Carter." As the meal progressed, Eleanor found herself navigating an intricate dance of conversation, deflecting veiled insults and responding to genuine curiosity with equal grace. Edward remained a steadfast ally, steering discussions away from hostility whenever possible, though his frustration with his aunt's behavior was evident. It wasn't until the luncheon was nearly over that Lady Beatrice delivered her most pointed attack. Over tea and light pastries, she turned to Eleanor with a deceptively pleasant smile. "Tell me, Miss Carter," she began, "what is it that you hope to achieve by entering our world? Surely you must have ambitions beyond mere association." Eleanor's hand paused mid-reach for her cup. The question was a trap, she knew, designed to either paint her as opportunistic or naive. She set her hand back in her lap, her expression composed. "My ambition, Lady Beatrice, is simply to broaden my understanding of the world and its people," Eleanor replied. "If I can do so while challenging the limitations that have been placed upon me, then I consider that a worthwhile endeavor." Lady Beatrice's smile didn't waver, but the glint in her eyes darkened. "How noble! But do you not fear that in reaching beyond your station, you risk alienating those who might otherwise support you?" Eleanor's stomach tightened, but she met the older woman's gaze without flinching. "On the contrary, Lady Beatrice, I found that those who truly value character over circumstance are the ones most worth having by one's side." A hush fell over the table, the weight of Eleanor's words sinking into the room like a stone into water. Edward's gaze flicked to his aunt, daring her to respond, but Lady Beatrice merely sipped her tea, her expression unreadable. After the luncheon, as the guests began to disperse, Edward escorted Eleanor to the garden, seeking a moment of respite. The crisp air and the scent of blooming winter roses provided a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the dining room. "You were extraordinary," Edward said as they walked along a gravel path. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone hold their own against my aunt like that." Eleanor smiled faintly, though the strain of the afternoon showed in her eyes. "It wasn't easy. I felt as though I were navigating a minefield, and yet you came through unscathed," Edward said. "More than that, you've earned the respect of some of our guests." Eleanor stopped, turning to face him, but not all. "Lady Beatrice won't forget what happened today, and I doubt she'll forgive it either." Edward's expression darkened. "She doesn't have to forgive it. She only has to accept that the world is changing, whether she likes it or not." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. "You've taken a great risk by inviting me into this world, Edward. I hope you understand the cost." "I do," Edward said firmly, "and I'd do it again in a heartbeat." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The garden seemed to hold its breath, the stillness broken only by the distant chirping of birds. Finally, Eleanor said, "Then I suppose we'll have to face whatever comes next together." Edward smiled. "Indeed we will." As the sun began to set, casting the estate in hues of gold and amber, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, she believed it might be worth the journey. The days following the luncheon were marked by an uneasy stillness in the Hastings household. While Eleanor carried out her usual duties with quiet efficiency, she couldn't ignore the shift in the air. Some staff members treated her with newfound deference, while others whispered behind her back. Among the Hastings family and their guests, the reaction was equally mixed. The luncheon had solidified her as a presence that could no longer be ignored, but acceptance was far from universal. Eleanor found solace in the quieter corners of the estate, particularly the conservatory, where she tended to the plants that brought her peace. On one such afternoon, as the golden light filtered through the glass panes, Edward appeared. His approach as familiar to her now as the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "You seem deep in thought," he remarked, his tone light as he stepped beside her. Eleanor glanced at him, her hands still in the soil of a potted fern. "It's been a strange few days." "I imagine so," Edward said. "You've made quite an impression, Eleanor. More than I think you realize." She shook her head, her expression thoughtful. "Not all impressions are good ones, Edward. I've seen the way some of your guests look at me. I don't belong in their world." Edward's brow furrowed. "Who decides that? Them? My aunt? They cling to traditions that are crumbling beneath their feet. You've already proven you're more than capable of standing among them." Eleanor wiped her hands on a cloth, her movements slow as she considered his words. "And yet, I feel like an intruder, like I've stepped into a play where I don't know the lines." Edward's voice softened. "Perhaps that's because the play itself is flawed. You don't need to conform to their script, Eleanor. You're writing your own." That evening, a knock at Eleanor's door startled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Lord Arthur Bellamy standing there, his ever-present smirk in place. "Lord Bellamy," she said, her voice cautious. "What brings you here?" "I thought I'd pay you a visit," he said lightly, though there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. "May I?" Eleanor hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. The room, modest and tidy, seemed almost comically out of place for a man of his station. Bellamy wandered to the small table by the window, picking up a book she had left there. "Voltaire," he noted, his tone impressed. "I wouldn't have guessed." Eleanor crossed her arms. "You didn't come here to discuss my reading habits, Lord Bellamy. What do you want?" He turned to face her, his smirk fading into something more serious. "I wanted to understand you, Miss Carter. You've managed to stir up quite a storm, and I find myself intrigued." "Intrigued," Eleanor repeated, her tone skeptical. Bellamy nodded. You've done what few others would dare, entered a world that was not made for you and faced it head on. I find that remarkable." Eleanor regarded him carefully. "And what is it you expect to find, Lord Bellamy? A curiosity? An anomaly?" "Perhaps," he admitted, his gaze steady. "Or perhaps something more." The words hung in the air between them, their weight unexpected. Before Eleanor could respond, he set the book back on the table and tipped an imaginary hat. "I won't take more of your time, but know this, Miss Carter, you've made more allies than you think." With that, he left, leaving Eleanor with more questions than answers. The following day, Eleanor joined Edward in the library, where he was reviewing correspondence. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Edward looked up as she entered, his expression brightening. "Good timing," he said. "I was just about to take a break." Eleanor sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Lord Bellamy came to see me last night." Edward's brows shot up. "Bellamy? What did he want?" "To understand me, or so he said," Eleanor replied. "He called me remarkable." Edward leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "He's not wrong." Eleanor frowned. "I don't know what to make of it. He's always seemed unpredictable." "He is," Edward agreed, "but he's also influential. If Bellamy is on your side, it could shift the tide in your favor." Eleanor tilted her head. "Do you think I need allies, Edward?" "I think we all do," he said, "especially when facing the kind of resistance you have." Eleanor studied him for a moment before saying softly, "You've been my greatest ally, Edward. I hope you know that." His gaze met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "I always will be." As the week wore on, Eleanor began to notice subtle changes. Some guests, like Bellamy, were warming to her, engaging her in conversation, and even seeking her opinions. Others, like Lady Beatrice, remained steadfast in their disdain, but their voices seemed less dominant. In the evenings, Eleanor often found herself in the company of Edward and a small circle of more open-minded guests. These gatherings, though informal, felt like a space where she could be herself without fear of judgment. Yet even in these moments, Eleanor couldn't ignore the barriers that remained. The world Edward was inviting her into was one built on centuries of exclusion and privilege. Bridging the gap between her past and this new reality would take more than charm and resilience. It would take a fundamental shift in the way she saw herself and her place in the world. One evening, as the household settled into a quiet calm, Eleanor stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens. The stars glittered overhead, their light reflecting in the still water of the fountain below. Edward joined her, his presence as steady as ever. "You've changed things, Eleanor," he said softly. "More than you realize." She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "And yet, I feel as though I've only just begun." Edward smiled. "That's the nature of change. It's slow, but once it starts, it's unstoppable." Eleanor looked out over the gardens, a faint smile on her lips. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that he might be right. The fire crackled softly in the drawing room as Eleanor sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth. The warmth of the flames contrasted sharply with the chill in her chest as Lady Beatrice's words from earlier in the day replayed in her mind. "Don't mistake tolerance for acceptance, Miss Carter," Lady Beatrice had said, her tone laced with icy disdain. "Your novelty will wear thin, and when it does, I trust you'll find your way back to where you belong." Eleanor's hands clenched involuntarily at the memory, though she kept her face composed. If she had learned anything over the past weeks, it was that outward grace was her strongest shield. Edward entered the room, carrying 2 glasses of wine. He placed one on the table beside Eleanor before settling into the chair across from her. "You've been quiet today," he observed. Eleanor met his gaze, the flickering firelight dancing in his eyes. Lady Beatrice had much to say. Edward's expression darkened. What did she say this time? Eleanor hesitated. She hadn't intended to burden him with Lady Beatrice's cruelty, but the weight of it was too much to carry alone. "She reminded me that my presence here is tolerated, not accepted, that this world is not mine, and it never will be." Edward leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "She's wrong. You've already proven you belong." "Have I?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft but edged with doubt. "Or have I only proven that I can endure?" "You've done far more than endure," Edward said firmly. "You've challenged their prejudices, forced them to see beyond their narrow definitions of worth." Eleanor looked away, her gaze falling to the glass of wine. "It doesn't feel that way." For a moment the room was silent, save for the soft crackle of the fire. Then Edward spoke, his voice quieter. "Do you know why I asked you to join that first dinner?" Eleanor shook her head. "I've wondered, but I don't understand it fully." Edward's gaze grew distant, as though he were looking back on a memory. "When I was younger, my father often spoke of the importance of tradition. He believed in it almost religiously. But my mother, she saw things differently. She used to say that true nobility isn't found in bloodlines or wealth, but in character." Eleanor's heart tightened. She had rarely heard Edward speak of his mother, who had died when he was still a boy. "She believed in treating everyone with dignity," Edward continued, "and she often pointed out how blind we were to the strength and wisdom of those we deemed beneath us." Eleanor's voice was soft. "She sounds remarkable." "She was," Edward said, his expression softening. "And when I see you, Eleanor, I see what she would have valued most. Intelligence, kindness, integrity. That's why I invited you, to honor her memory and to prove that she was right." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected such vulnerability from him, and it stirred something deep within her. For a moment, they sat in silence, the space between them charged with unspoken emotions. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward smiled faintly. "You've done more than I ever could have hoped for, but there's something I need to ask of you." Eleanor tilted her head. "What is it?" "I want you to tell me about your father," Edward said. "You've mentioned him before, but only briefly. I'd like to know more." Eleanor hesitated, the request catching her off guard. She rarely spoke of her father, the memories too bittersweet, but there was something in Edward's expression, an openness, a quiet respect that made her want to share. "My father was a teacher," she began, her voice steady but soft. "He believed in the power of education to change lives. He taught at a small school in the village where I grew up, and he was beloved by his students." Edward listened intently, his focus unwavering. "But he wasn't content to teach only the privileged," Eleanor continued. "He believed that knowledge should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their station. He often taught the children of laborers and farmers in his spare time, much to the disapproval of the local gentry." "What happened to him?" Edward asked gently. Eleanor's gaze dropped to her lap. "He was dismissed from his position when he refused to stop teaching the less fortunate. After that, he struggled to find work. My mother died shortly after, and he became consumed by his ideals. He died penniless but unbroken." Edward's voice was soft. "He sounds like a remarkable man." "He was," Eleanor said, her throat tightening. "But his convictions cost him everything." Edward reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on hers. "And yet, his legacy lives on in you." The fire crackled again, filling the quiet that followed Edward's words. Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest, a sense of being seen and understood that she hadn't realized she craved. "You've carried his values forward," Edward continued, "and in doing so, you've inspired more change than you know." Eleanor met his gaze, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not sure I've done enough." "You've done more than enough," Edward said. "But if there's more you want to do, I'll be there to help you." Eleanor's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and resolve. For the first time, she felt as though she wasn't carrying the weight of her past alone. Later that evening, as Eleanor returned to her room, she found herself reflecting on Edward's words. She thought of her father, his unyielding belief in justice, and the quiet strength he had passed on to her. Standing before the small mirror on her wall, Eleanor whispered, "I won't let you down, Father." The reflection staring back at her seemed steadier, more assured. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Eleanor knew she was ready to face them. The Hastings estate was alive with activity. The annual charity gala, A much-anticipated event among the elite was in full swing. The ballroom glittered with opulence. Chandeliers cast golden light over guests adorned in silk and jewels, and the murmur of polite conversation filled the air between the strains of a string quartet. Yet beneath the sheen of elegance, an undercurrent of tension pulsed. For Eleanor, the gala felt like the ultimate test. Edward had insisted she attend, and though she had initially resisted, she now found herself standing at his side, clad in a gown of deep burgundy that Mary had miraculously altered to fit her. The dress was beautiful, but it did little to quell her unease. She was acutely aware of the gazes that followed her every movement, their judgment palpable, even in the polite smiles. "You're doing fine," Edward murmured as they entered the room, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "Remember, you've earned your place here." Eleanor nodded, though her heart was pounding. She wasn't sure if she believed him, but she knew she couldn't falter now. The evening progressed in a blur of introductions and carefully curated conversations. Eleanor answered questions with poise, even as some guests veiled their curiosity with thinly disguised condescension. Lord Arthur Bellamy, ever the provocateur, made a point of engaging her in lively debates, which drew both admiration and ire from the surrounding crowd. "Miss Carter," Bellamy said during one such exchange, his tone deliberately loud enough to capture the attention of those nearby, "you must tell me your thoughts on the notion of inherited privilege. Do you believe it has any merit, or is it merely an outdated relic?" Eleanor hesitated, aware that her answer could easily spark controversy. But as she glanced at Edward, his subtle nod reassured her. "I believe," she began, her voice steady, "that privilege, inherited or otherwise, carries a responsibility. Those who possess it have the opportunity, and I would argue, the obligation to use it for the betterment of others." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, some guests nodding in agreement while others exchanged skeptical glances. Bellamy grinned, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "A measured response," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "But one that begs the question, how many among us truly fulfill that obligation?" Before Eleanor could respond, Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her expression icy. "An interesting perspective," Lady Beatrice interjected, her voice cutting through the conversation. "But I wonder, Miss Carter, if you've considered the dangers of overstepping one's station. Ambition, after all, can be a double-edged sword." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Eleanor. The challenge in Lady Beatrice's tone was unmistakable, and Eleanor knew this was no casual remark. It was a direct attack. Edward stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "And Beatrice, I believe ambition is only dangerous when wielded without integrity. Eleanor has shown nothing but grace and strength in navigating a world that many would have deemed inaccessible to her." Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "And yet one must question the wisdom of inviting such experiments. Not all who enter our world are equipped to understand its nuances, let alone thrive within it." Eleanor felt the heat of indignation rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. Drawing a deep breath, she met Lady Beatrice's gaze head-on. "Lady Beatrice," she said, her voice steady but resolute, "if navigating this world requires the kind of grace you've displayed tonight, then perhaps it is not as inaccessible as it seems." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and for a moment, Lady Beatrice's composure faltered. Her lips tightened, and her pale complexion flushed with anger. "You dare," Lady Beatrice began, but she was cut off by Bellamy's sudden, raucous laughter. "Bravo, Miss Carter!" Bellamy exclaimed, clapping his hands together. A more eloquent rebuttal I could not have imagined. The tension in the room broke slightly as some guests chuckled nervously, their discomfort giving way to reluctant admiration. Lady Beatrice, however, was far from amused. "This is precisely why one must be cautious," she said coldly, addressing the room rather than Eleanor directly. "A sense of decorum, once lost, is difficult to regain." Edward's voice was sharp. "Decorum is meaningless without fairness, Aunt Beatrice. Perhaps it's time we reevaluate what truly matters." The exchange left an indelible mark on the evening. While some guests avoided Eleanor for the rest of the night, others sought her out, intrigued by her boldness. Lord Bellamy continued to hover nearby, his expressions of admiration bordering on the theatrical. "You've won over a great many tonight, Miss Carter," Bellamy remarked as they stood near the refreshment table. "Though I suspect Lady Beatrice will not soon forget this evening, nor will I," Eleanor replied, her voice quiet but firm. "Not because of the conflict, but because it showed me what I'm capable of." Bellamy tilted his head, his expression softening. "A wise observation. You've more strength than most here, myself included." Eleanor offered a faint smile. "Strength isn't always in. There's still much to prove." "Perhaps," Bellamy said, "but if tonight is any indication, you're well on your way." As the evening wound down, Edward found Eleanor near the edge of the ballroom, gazing out one of the tall windows. The moonlight bathed her face in a soft glow, and for a moment he simply watched her, struck by her quiet resilience. "You handled yourself brilliantly," Edward said, stepping beside her. Eleanor turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "It didn't feel brilliant. It felt necessary. And that's what makes it brilliant," Edward said. "You spoke the truth, even when it wasn't easy. That's more than most here can say." Eleanor hesitated before speaking. "Do you ever wonder if this is worth it? All of it? The scrutiny, the battles?" Edward's gaze softened. "I don't wonder, Eleanor. I know it's worth it. Because you're worth it." The sincerity in his voice left her momentarily speechless. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to smile a real, unguarded smile. "Thank you, Edward," she said softly. As the last of the guests departed and the music faded into the night, Eleanor felt a sense of quiet triumph. The path ahead remained uncertain, but tonight she had taken a stand, and that, she knew, was only the beginning. The days following the gala brought a mix of reactions. Eleanor's confrontation with Lady Beatrice had sparked conversations not only within the Hastings household, but across the circles of the elite. Some guests viewed Eleanor as an audacious figure, a disruptor of tradition. Others spoke of her with newfound respect, recognizing the strength she had displayed. Eleanor, however, felt a profound sense of transition. The gala had marked a turning point, not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe she could carve out a place in this world, not by conforming to its expectations, but by reshaping them. One crisp morning, Eleanor found herself walking the grounds of the Hastings estate, the winter air sharp against her cheeks. Edward had asked to meet her by the fountain in the gardens, and she suspected he had something important to discuss. As she approached, she saw him standing there, his posture relaxed, but his expression thoughtful. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her breath visible in the cold air. Edward turned to her, his face brightening. "I did. There's something I'd like to talk to you about." Eleanor crossed her arms, tilting her head. "This sounds serious." "In a way, it is," Edward admitted. He gestured to a nearby bench, and they sat together, the fountain's gentle trickle providing a soothing backdrop. After the gala, Edward began. "I started to think about the larger implications of what we've been doing. You've proven that the boundaries of this society are not as rigid as they appear, but I think we can go further." Eleanor frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I've been speaking with Lord Bellamy and a few other allies," Edward explained. "They agree that there's an opportunity to foster real change, not just in how people like my aunt perceive worth, but in how this society functions as a whole." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You're talking about reform." "Yes," Edward said, his tone resolute. "It's a daunting task, I know, but it's one I believe we can undertake together. Your insight, your strength, they've already inspired so many. Imagine what we could accomplish if we worked toward something tangible." The weight of his words settled over Eleanor like a heavy cloak. The idea of challenging the very foundations of this world was overwhelming, but it was also exhilarating. For so long, she had fought simply to be seen, to prove her worth. Now, Edward was offering her a chance to shape something greater. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Eleanor said honestly. "It's a lot." Edward reached for her hand, his touch warm despite the chill in the air. "You don't have to decide now, but I want you to know that whatever you choose, I'll support you." Eleanor looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. For all her doubts, she felt a spark of possibility ignite within her. Later that day, Eleanor found herself in the library, poring over books on history and social structures. If she was going to consider Edward's proposal seriously, she needed to understand the system they sought to change. Mary entered the room, her expression curious. "You've been in here for hours. What's going on?" Eleanor glanced up from her book, a wry smile on her lips. "Edward has a rather ambitious idea. He wants to push for reform among the aristocracy." Mary's eyebrows shot up. "Reform? As in changing the rules they've lived by for centuries?" "Exactly," Eleanor said. "He believes it's possible, but I'm not sure." Mary sat across from her, her gaze steady. "Do you believe in what he's trying to do?" Eleanor hesitated. "I do, but believing in it and being ready to fight for it are two different things." Mary reached across the table, taking Eleanor's hand in hers. "You've already proven you can stand up to them. You faced Lady Beatrice herself and come out stronger. If anyone can help Edward with this, it's you." Eleanor's chest tightened at Mary's words. She had never thought of herself as a force for change, but perhaps that was exactly what she had become. In the days that followed, Eleanor began to notice subtle shifts within the household. Edward's closest allies, including Lord Bellamy, visited more frequently, and their conversations often revolved around the concept of inclusivity and fairness. Even some of the more conservative guests seemed to be reconsidering their positions, though they were careful not to voice their doubts too openly. Eleanor, for her part, continued to wrestle with her doubts. She spent her evenings reflecting on the path ahead, her mind filled with questions. Could she truly make a difference? Was she prepared to face the resistance that would inevitably come? One evening, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, Edward joined her. The stars glittered overhead, and the crisp air carried the faint scent of pine. "You've been quiet late," Edward said, gently. "I've had a lot to think about," Eleanor admitted. "This idea of yours, it's bold, but it's also terrifying." Edward smiled faintly. "The best ideas often are." Eleanor turned to him, her expression serious. "Do you really believe we can change anything? That this world can be better?" "I do," Edward said without hesitation. "And I believe you're a vital part of that change." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their unspoken understanding settling between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "Then let's do it," she said softly. "Let's see how far we can go." Edward's smile widened, his eyes bright with determination. "Together, we can go further than either of us ever imagined." As they gazed out over the darkened gardens, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, but she was ready to face it. With Edward by her side, she felt she could take on anything. The first step toward change was a gathering unlike any the Hastings estate had seen before. Edward, with Eleanor at his side, had arranged a symposium inviting a mix of traditional aristocrats, progressive thinkers, and representatives from the working class. The aim was clear: to open a dialogue about the inequalities embedded in their society and to explore paths toward reform. Eleanor stood in the great hall, the room bustling with activity as guests arrived. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of anticipation and skepticism. She smoothed the fabric of her dress, a soft blue that Mary had once again tailored to perfection. Despite the nerves fluttering in her chest, Eleanor felt a quiet determination. This was the moment to prove that change was possible. Edward appeared at her side, his presence grounding her. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with excitement. Eleanor nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The symposium began with Edward addressing the crowd. He spoke eloquently about the importance of recognizing the humanity in every individual, regardless of their station. His words were met with polite applause, though Eleanor could sense the undercurrent of resistance among some of the more traditional attendees. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "My name is Eleanor Carter," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of so many eyes on her. "I am not a member of your world. I was born into a life of service, raised to believe that my worth was determined by my ability to stay unseen and unheard." She paused, letting the words settle. "But over the past weeks, I have been given an opportunity to step into a space that was never meant for me. And what I have seen is a society that prides itself on its refinement and intellect, yet clings to traditions that exclude and diminish." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Eleanor pressed on. "I do not stand here to accuse or to condemn. I stand here to ask a question. What kind of society do we want to be? One that protects its privileges at all costs, or one that recognizes the strength in diversity and the power of inclusion?" Her words hung in the air, the room so quiet that she could hear the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Finally, Lord Bellamy broke the silence with a slow clap, his expression one of genuine admiration. Others hesitantly joined in, and the applause grew until it filled the room. The discussions that followed were spirited and, at times, heated. Lady Beatrice, true to form, voiced her disapproval with icy precision. "What you propose, Miss Carter, is nothing short of a dismantling of everything that defines us. And perhaps it's time we reconsider what defines us." Eleanor replied calmly, "Tradition is only valuable if it serves the greater good." Others, including Lord Bellamy and a few younger aristocrats, supported Eleanor and Edward's vision. "Miss Carter raises an excellent point," Bellamy said. "What good is tradition if it blinds us to progress?" The working class representatives, though initially hesitant, began to share their experiences, highlighting the barriers they faced and the potential they saw in a more equitable society. As the evening wore on, the dialogue grew more collaborative, with even some skeptics engaging in thoughtful debate. By the time the symposium concluded, it was clear that a seed had been planted. While no immediate resolutions were reached, the event had succeeded in challenging assumptions and opening minds. Eleanor felt a sense of accomplishment, but knew that the real work was just beginning. As the last of the guests departed, Edward found Eleanor in the garden, the cool night air refreshing after the intensity of the evening. "You were extraordinary," Edward said, his voice filled with pride. Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's only a start. There's so much more to do, and we'll do it," Edward said firmly. Together, Eleanor met his gaze, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something she hadn't yet allowed herself to name. "Thank you, Edward, for believing in me. I always will," he said softly. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the symposium began to spread. Letters arrived daily from attendees, some expressing support, others voicing concerns or offering counterarguments. Edward and Eleanor worked tirelessly, drafting proposals and organizing follow-up meetings. Their partnership deepened, each drawing strength from the other. Eleanor found herself relying on Edward's unwavering confidence, while Edward drew inspiration from Eleanor's clarity and resilience. Their shared vision became a bond that transcended mere friendship. One evening, as they worked late in the library, Edward set down his pen and looked at Eleanor. "There's something I need to say," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Eleanor glanced up from her notes, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" Edward hesitated, then spoke. "This journey we're on, it's not just about reform. It's about you and me." Eleanor, she held up a hand, her cheeks flushing. "Edward, you don't have to say it, but I want to," he said, his tone earnest. "You've changed my life, Eleanor. You've shown me a world I never truly saw before. And somewhere along the way, I realized that Edward," Eleanor interrupted gently, her voice trembling. "I feel it too." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of their emotions filling the room. Then Edward reached for her hand, and she let him, her heart pounding. "We'll face it together," he said softly. "Whatever comes next," Eleanor nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. Together, the following spring, as the gardens of the Hastings estate bloomed with new life, Eleanor stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds. The world had not changed overnight, but she could feel the shift in the air, a growing momentum, a sense of possibility. Edward joined her, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That this is only the beginning," Eleanor said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "And I'm ready for whatever comes next." Edward smiled, his gaze warm. "So am I." Together, they looked out over the horizon, their partnership and their love ready to face a future they would shape together.